I want you to take a moment to look at the person next to you. Imagine that before we got started tonight, they told you of a time when they were trapped in a burning building in the middle of a bushfire and struggled to escape. What would you say to them? Would you think to ask why they found it hard to get out? If they were telling you about their friend's experience and their friend didn't make it out, would you think to ask what was wrong with the friend that they couldn't get out? Or decided it was safer to stay than deal with the flames outside? Even if you've never seen a building on fire, I don't think most of us would ask these questions. Because you don't have to have been trapped in a burning building to understand how disorienting it would be. How exits might look very different when the air is thick with smoke. We wouldn't say someone lacked courage because they couldn't get out, especially if we knew there was a chance they could get hurt outside of the building. We would understand that the experience is disorienting and that only from a distance would there appear to be an easy, clear course of action. We would understand that surviving a catastrophe is not a reflection of a person's character. 41% of Australian adults have experienced physical or sexual violence. Around 23% of the women present in the room tonight will experience physical, sexual, emotional, or financial violence. 22% will experience or have experienced sexual violence from a non-partner. Of the men here tonight, between 5 to 14% of you will experience these things. 1 in 3 Australian teenagers have experienced intimate partner violence in the last 12 months, including adolescents as young as 12. And because we are in a regional area particularly impacted by domestic violence, the figures for this region are likely much higher than what I have stated. I want to talk to you tonight about domestic violence as a system of entrapment. But to do this, we can't just talk about the flames inside the building. We also need to talk about the flames outside that are made up of the systems designed to help, but that often unwittingly compound harm. And an important part of this story is to think about what we expect from those who are suffering psychologically. This is about domestic violence, but it is not just about domestic violence, nor is what I'm about to say only relevant to women. If you've experienced emotional pain, grief, or trauma, you've almost certainly already recognized that there are certain rules around what society holds up as a socially acceptable way of talking about these things, especially on social media. Put simply, we have expectations for those in distress. And those expectations are reflected in the language people use to try to contain their darkest experiences. Even with those closest to us, there are often unspoken rules around how to answer simple questions like, how are you? Men especially are told to be tough, stoic, and in charge, to conceal their feelings and conquer rather than understand their pain. This type of masculinity denies men not just their emotions, but their humanity. And often, it costs them their lives. For many of us, particularly those with British ancestry, suppressing our emotions is a preferred pastime. But in the 13 years since Brené Brown made the case for vulnerability on the TEDx stage, personal disclosures have increasingly come to punctuate the spaces where silence has once existed. Vulnerability has become a social media brand and a currency, often used by the powerful to soften our sense of their power. Relatability is now predicated on telling people about your deepest fears, your flaws and failings, your most personal experiences. Our appetite for shining a light on the parts of life previously considered private has never been greater. And in many ways, this is a good thing. Stigma and shame grow best in the dark. But the rules around how to experience the hardest moments of our lives can influence the care and compassion we receive. One rule for telling socially acceptable stories of vulnerability is to make sure that as the main character, you suffer, but you show that you've found a way to manage and use your suffering, recognizing the opportunity it presents. The wisdom of the self-empowerment movement is that your suffering might be great, but you are greater. According to humanistic psychology, the cream always rises to the top. We're told that life is what you make it, and if you put in the work, you can do anything. From this point of view, every human experience is an opportunity to perform. Bad things can happen to you and you can talk about them, but only if those bad things have made you bigger, better, faster, and stronger. Personal development becomes the silver lining in an otherwise unpalatable tale, giving ourselves and our audiences a softer landing. The most acceptable stories of suffering are told in the past tense. These stories need to have a clear beginning, middle, and end, because a key part of storytelling is that at some point, you're expected to stop telling that story. We quite like the tension of a story where the audience wonders if hardship will overcome the main character, as long as that tension ends. The stories that make us uncomfortable are the stories configured around wounds that break open again and again, as the wounds of trauma so often do. In a culture that values individual responsibility and personal growth, those who don't seem able to escape their suffering make us profoundly uncomfortable. Let's talk about why this is problematic in the context of domestic violence. First, within the repertoire of performative choices neoliberalism offers to women, self-optimization has become a religion. And in this religion, morality is assured when you can demonstrate self-empowerment in the control you enact over yourself, your diet, exercise, health, work, and your management of your emotions and your mental health. The performance of wellness and agency is at best a distraction from the harm women face, and at worst, it is a form of entrapment in itself. If exercising individual agency was a preventative for violence against women, then the statistics to which I alluded earlier would look very different. My generation has been armed with advice on how to stay safe by monitoring our behaviour, our clothing, the signals we give to men, the caution we exercise when rejecting them. And not only does this not work, this advice is not aimed at preventing harm, just ensuring someone else who is less self-disciplined than you gets harmed instead. Wellness culture doesn't seem to focus on manifesting the right to walk home alone or go to your workplace without being killed. But this is not just about neoliberal wellness. Feminism too has made itself palatable by telling women to focus on themselves and their aspirations, positioning personal empowerment as the height of what women should aspire to. Telling women that they are powerful beyond measure when one woman dies of domestic violence in Australia every 9 days does not make women safer. It only furthers the responsibility that women bear for male violence. The illusion of individual empowerment doubles the penalty. The first penalty is of violence. The second are the rules that dictate how a good victim should rebuild themselves in response to it. The notion that life will work for you if you work too fails to acknowledge that the women who break out of domestic violence typically do so on an ad hoc basis that favours the white and the middle class. And too often, the systems implicated in supporting those experiencing violence provide support on the same conditional basis that the general public offers their compassion. Mental health systems favour those with the financial capital to invest in themselves, who show that they can self-regulate, take responsibility, and commit to rebuilding, preferably within the time frame of 10 therapy sessions. If women can perform to these standards, our empathy and appetite for hearing their story grows, because we are able to translate a story of harm into a story of transformation. If victims are not able to perform to these standards, then their stories are typically received differently, and their experiences with mental health systems are much more likely to be adversarial. Imagine for a moment that you are in a relationship where your partner consistently tells you that how you see things isn't right, that what you think happened didn't happen, or didn't mean what you think it did. Stressed, You seek out psychological support. Several forms of harm can follow. One is that your distress becomes rebranded as illness and diagnosed as a mental health condition. Some diagnoses are warranted and helpful. Others simply formally validate the perpetrator's ongoing invalidation of the victim, and this is especially the case where the diagnosis is highly stigmatized. As an example, borderline personality disorder is characterized by emotional instability and a fear of abandonment, with 75% of those diagnoses received by women, and many of those women who have experienced significant trauma. When a victim receives a mental health diagnosis precipitated by the stress of violence, this diagnosis may then be held up by the perpetrator as a justification for their violent behaviour, used as evidence of the poor reliability of the victim and a reason for why the perpetrator should retain custody of any children. Men are rarely diagnosed as borderline, despite the fact that possessiveness and attempts to control a partner might be understood as stemming from a deep-set fear of abandonment. The systems of psychology do not broadly engage with nor pathologize expressions of power and control. While a man who expresses fear through domination reinforces his masculinity in the process. We rarely call perpetrators weak. More often, we call them monsters. A characterization that conveys our revulsion at the violence, but also inadvertently reinforces the social power of perpetrators. Another outcome of seeking psychological support is that you receive therapy focused on changing your thinking, where the psychologist asks you to examine and adjust your perceptions of the world and yourself. The intentions of this may be positive, but it is easy to see how this replicates the same mechanisms of destabilization used by perpetrators, all while the therapy process centers the victim as their own personal project. This is not to say that seeking psychological support is fruitless and that our current systems are without value and meaning. Much valuable, authentic work underpinned by an ethos of care is performed by many professionals in the mental health industry. But it is to say that the systems designed to support victims can become another way of monitoring their behaviour and weaponising their distress. To those listening whose lives have intersected with harm, I want to say this. You do not have to self-actualise, manage your distress, and ensure your story has a neat endpoint to be worthy of care and compassion. Psychological well-being is a wonderful thing, but it is not a moral success. And your life isn't worth more simply because you've learnt something from your pain. We tell women who leave domestic violence that they are brave, but so too are the women who stay. There is no choice in a tragedy that isn't difficult. Whether you've experienced violence or another type of harm, your experiences don't have to be contained, mastered, and used for good. They don't have to be used at all. You don't have to do the work on the terms laid out by a disordered society. You were never the problem to begin with. Focusing on self-empowerment in the face of domestic violence might bring some sense of control to the situation, but self-empowerment that speaks to the transformation of the victim rather than the perpetrator does not create safety for any of us. If you can share your suffering and vulnerability and help others make sense of their pain in the process, that's a beautiful thing. But if how you're told to talk about the worst things that have happened to you leave you with less freedom than you had before, you're not being asked to be vulnerable. You're being asked to perform vulnerability. True care for other people asks that we accept the stories of suffering that are neither linear nor past tense. Vulnerability curated for social media may result in social capital, but it doesn't create connection. It creates the illusion of connection. Experiencing trauma might be a catalyst for your evolution as a person, but it doesn't have to be. It's okay to just survive. You don't have to make the survival beautiful.